First tonight, a team of Canada's premiers entered the White House this afternoon hoping to take their fight against tariffs straight to the source. A short time ago, they left following what they call a constructive meeting. For more on that, let's bring in CBC's Katie Simpson, who spent much of the day at the White House and joins us now from our Washington bureau. And Katie, what are we hearing from the premiers this evening?
Well, the premiers were able to secure some face time with two senior White House officials. However, they're not the officials that really are the ones that are going to be shaping Donald Trump's decision on this. But we'll have more about that in just a second. They sat down with a deputy chief of staff. His name is James Blair, and they met with a senior advisor who deals with hiring in the White House. It is a big deal for the premiers to get into the White House itself and to have a meeting with these high-ranking officials. But again, what we understand from the conversation, it has been described as constructive and pleasant by both sides. Pleasant coming from the American side, constructive coming from the Canadian side. And essentially the goal was in this case for the Canadians to get a better understanding of what it is exactly Donald Trump wants in order for Canada to avoid tariffs. Canadians will very well be aware of what seems to be shifting goalposts. Donald Trump complaining about border security with the North, complaining about the trade deficit, complaining about other issues that sort of seem to sort of shift around. The premiers were in the White House for just over an hour and emerged with what they say seems to be a better sense of what the Trump administration may be looking for.
Well, it's a good conversation, back and forth, and it was a very positive conversation. So we'll see how we move forward. And once all their secretaries get sworn in, then we can move forward.
That's the next thing that you can look forward is Secretary of Commerce will be sworn in. Minister LeBlanc will be working with him, and premiers will be supporting that work and reaching out and doing our own advocacy like we have been the last day or two.
So in terms of some of the issues they discussed, British Columbia Premier David Eby sort of got into that. It's what we've sort of been hearing the Premier say publicly, talking about, how American tariffs would hurt not just the Canadian economy, but the American economy, how it would make the cost of living more expensive, how it could hurt American jobs. But he also outlined how there seemed to be some very blunt conversation at the table.
Yeah, we had frank conversations where about the 51st state comment, where we underlined that was a non-starter. That was obviously consistent among all the premiers, and for my part, just underlining how important it was to share information and concerns related to fentanyl on the border with the premiers as well. There are enforcement actions that we can take to make sure that information is flowing. If these are the key points of frustration for the president, we want to take action on those things too.
So something in there that Premier Eby said seemed to get the attention of one of the officials who was in that meeting, one of the White House officials. James Blair, who is the deputy chief of staff, who was in the meeting, put on social media, to be very clear, I believe he described it as a pleasant meeting with the premiers, but he said that, they never agreed that Canada would not be the 51st state, but they would just pass Premier Eby's comments on to the president. This, of course, is something that Canadians are deeply angry about when Donald Trump talks about Canada becoming the 51st state, when he talks about taking Canada by economic force, and of course, the ongoing impact of these tariff threats and what it's doing to the stability of the Canadian economy and what the potential is for Canadian economic loss.
So, Katie, at this point, are there any signs that the Trump administration wants to soften its approach on tariffs?
Short answer in this moment is no, but what it's going to take for the Canadian sort of side to sort of like see some movement on this, it's going to be more meetings, more conversations, and these kinds of engagements. Also at the White House today, Canada's Finance Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, and Canada's Ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, they had a meeting with much more senior officials at the White House. Howard Lutnick, who is the incoming Commerce Secretary, as well as a National Economic Advisor. They had a conversation. Hillman and LeBlanc were in the White House for about just over an hour as well. The finance minister emerging, seeming somewhat optimistic, but again, reiterating the point about Canada's commitment to improve border security, even though Canada continues to point out that Canada is responsible for less than 1% of the fentanyl that crosses into the U.S., less than 1% of the illegal immigration into the U.S. Those points continue to be made, but really it was about highlighting the changes changes that Canada is making when it comes to border security, talking about the new fentanyl czar that has been appointed and announced. And really, one other thing that sort of stood out from coming out of that meeting is Canada's ambassador to the U.S. talked about how the American officials know that there is an anger in Canada, that Canadians, just ordinary Canadians, are very, very frustrated, and they are uniting because the not just the economic threats, but the annexation threats, the 51st state threats, those are kinds of things that have sparked a real deep sense of anger and frustration among Canadians. And she says it's known in D.C.
Yeah, they're attacking our sovereignty. CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington. Thank you for this, Katie.
Thanks.
Joining us to discuss this historic Premier's meeting is Christopher Cochrane in Markham, Ontario this evening. He's an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And Professor, what do you think of this first of its kind meeting? What does this signify for Canada, our premiers down there at the White House?
Well, it's been said over and over again. It's unprecedented. Normally, trade relations, Canada and the United States, they're sometimes handled province to state. Obviously, premiers have been involved with federal governments, often behind the scenes. But to have such a sort of high-profile, very public trade delegation led by all of the premiers to go down and speak directly to the U.S. federal government about tariffs is unprecedented. And it reflects a lot of things. Part of it, obviously, is the unique nature of the Trump administration and the threat of tariffs. Part of it also is the historic sort of weakened position of the federal government because of the uncertainty about leadership and the outgoing sort of lame duck prime minister that we have now until the Liberal Party chooses a new leader and ultimately a new prime minister for Canada.
You heard Katie mention there our sovereignty. They're putting out statements about it, say they haven't agreed that we wouldn't be the 51st state. What does it mean then, this meeting coming from our premiers and not our prime minister, who you just referred to as a lame duck? How does this reflect on Canada?
It's not a position of strength. I think it could be a lot worse. I think that's the good news. I think the fact that they've gone down together to present a unified front, relatively unified front, is good news. But you even saw in the press conferences, for example, I think Susan Holt made a very sort of gave a thoughtful answer about what aspects would be up for negotiation and would dairy be considered. And she said we needed to renegotiate the USMCA. And those were the kinds of questions that would arise in those negotiations. And right after that, the Premier of Quebec, Mr. Legault, came up and said that it was absolutely non-negotiable for Quebec. So I think those sorts of lines of disagreement, in addition to comparison between Doug Ford and Danielle Smith, all of those have created real challenges for the unified message that Canada would want to send to the U.S. in the midst of these negotiations.
Yeah, diplomacy versus retaliation. They're still trying to come together on those fronts. What negotiation tactics do you anticipate that our premiers are using down there? Do we really have any leverage here?
Not much. This is part of the challenge. I think it's in normal circumstances very wise. You go down, you negotiate with especially Republican members of Congress from states that are most likely to be directly affected. But from all the indications that we've seen, it's the Trump presidency that controls the Republican Congress, not the other way around. There's been very little success among any Republicans at checking the power of this administration. We saw that with his ability to get his nominees through for cabinet. I suspect we'll see more of that. Trump's not just a president, obviously, but also in command of a very large and active base within the Republican Party that's threatening to remove Republican members of Congress if they contravene Trump's agenda. So it may help in getting some quiet lobbying behind the scenes, but we've seen no indications at all that Republican members of Congress have a willingness to stand up to this president, even if it's advocating for the citizens of their state.
And you say that, how about advocating for Canada? I mean, how does Trump's remarks on Canada become the 51st state? Very worrying in this country, impact these discussions we're going through, because it keeps being brought up, and it seems like maybe that's the end game here.
Well, we have to talk to him in the meantime, and it's a predicament that I think we've been lulled into getting ourselves into. for the last several decades, the worst case scenario, it seems to me, when Canadians would think about American administrations would be that we'd have an American administration that was indifferent altogether to our interests. Normally, they would be supportive of our interests. I don't think anyone envisioned a scenario, at least not before 2016, of an administration hostile to Canada's interests and to Canada's independence. That's clearly what's at issue now. And I think there's a lot that has to be done in Canada if we want to insulate ourselves from these kinds of threats. National unity is great. Seeing the premiers come together, all of that is obviously a necessary condition. But there's going to be a lot of real work and a lot of real costs that'll need to be incurred in order to reorient an economy on an east-west axis. And we're seeing some talk about that. It's a lot easier said than done. But as a very first urgent priority, there'll have to be east-west infrastructure, which Canadians have done in the past, but not for very many decades. And there'll also have to be an elimination of the soft barriers to trade that exist between provinces that Canadians have been talking about decade after decade after decade and have been incapable of resolving. The urgency of resolving that is massively intensified now that we can't really rely on north-south trade routes, which are natural, but are being actively and deliberately obstructed by an American administration for its own stated purpose of bringing Canada into the U.S. fold. That's unacceptable to any Canadian political leader, but it's going to require a lot of work to insulate ourselves from those kinds of pressures.
Christopher Cochrane is an associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Professor, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Dwight.